Imagine being a parent. You spent years raising your child. You feed them, you protect them, you worry about them. You watch them grow from a helpless baby into an adult. And even when that child is grown, something inside a parent never really changes. You still worry about them. You still want them to be safe. You still believe that when everything else goes wrong, family is the one place you can trust. Now imagine discovering that the person you trusted most was the person who wanted you dead. For John and Lois McCullough, the imaginable nightmare became reality. Their daughter, Virginia McCullough, was living with them in their home in Gloucestershire. But behind the closed doors of that house was a secret. Virginia had been stealing from her parents. She had been lying to them. She had accumulated serious debts. And according to the sentencing judge, she eventually began thinking about killing them. What happened next was not simply a moment of anger. It was planned. There was a primary plan and there was a backup plan. In June 2019, John McCullough was poisoned. And when the same plan did not kill his wife Lois, Virginia carried out the backup plan against her own mother. Then came the deception. For more than 4 years, Virginia would pretend that her parents were still alive. She sent messages from their phones. She pretended to be her mother. She contacted family members. She dealt with their finances. And she continued taking money that belonged to her dead parents. For 4 years and 3 months, the truth remained hidden. Until one concerned doctor asked a question that would eventually bring everything crashing down. Where were John and Lois McCullough? This is the disturbing story of Virginia McCullough, a daughter, a double murderer, and a woman who managed to convince her own family that her dead parents were still alive. To understand this case, we first have to go back to the family home. Virginia McCullough was the youngest of 5 daughters. Her 4 sisters had already left the family home by 2019. Virginia, however, was still living with her parents. Her mother, Lois, was 71 years old. Her father, John, was 70. John had severe health problems, including hypertension, type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, and glaucoma. Lois suffered from anxiety and agoraphobia and had traits of obsessive-compulsive disorder. They were not simply elderly strangers living alone. They were Virginia's parents, and Virginia was someone they trusted. The court heard that Virginia did not have regular employment or a regular income. Her father gave her money and she helped deal with some of her parents' financial arrangements. That position of trust would eventually become extremely important. Because while John and Lois believed their daughter was helping them, Virginia was stealing from them. According to the sentencing judge, she secured loans in their names without their knowledge. She spent money gambling online. She went shopping. And when her parents began suffering financial losses, she created explanations. She told them they had been victims of fraud. She blamed banking problems. She claimed their accounts had been hacked. She even invented supposed police and corporate investigations, which she told them would eventually result in their money being returned. But the money wasn't coming back because the person taken was inside their own home. Virginia also lied about having employment, and she lied about medical conditions she did not have. Eventually, the financial situation became increasingly serious. By 17th June 2019, Virginia was almost £60,000 in debt. And according to the judge, it was around this period that the situation reached a terrifying turning point. In March 2019, Virginia began contemplating killing both of her parents. She later said she felt trapped. She described wanting to be free from them, but the judge rejected that as the main explanation for what happened. Instead, the court found a compelling financial motive. Virginia knew what her dishonesty was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. And if her parents discovered the truth, she risked losing access to their money. So a plan began to form. And this was not a plan created in a single afternoon. It developed over months. The judge found that Virginia accumulated a large quantity of prescription medication. In May 2019, she bought a knife. She also bought implements that could be used to crush and separate tablets. Then came something particularly disturbing. Virginia began testing the effects of the drugs. She put small amounts into her parents' lunch. She was, in effect, testing what would happen. Then 2 days before the murderers, she drugged her father's drink. The court described this as using him as a guinea pig. It gave us an insight into just how deliberate the planning had become. The plan was simple. Drugs would be the primary method. But Virginia had another plan waiting in case the first one failed. A backup plan. And that backup plan involved weapons. On the evening of 17th June 2019, Virginia put a cocktail of prescription drugs into her parents' drinks. The intention was to kill them. The following morning, Virginia discovered that her father, John, was dead in his bed, but Lois was still alive. Virginia had not given her mother as much of the drug mixture, and Lois had not drunk all of it. The primary plan had failed to kill her, so Virginia turned to the backup plan. She attacked her mother with a hammer. Imagine for a moment what those final moments must have been like for Lois. She was in her own home, in her own bedroom, with her own daughter nearby. And then suddenly her daughter attacked her. The sentencing judge said that Lois's last conscious moment was the realization that her daughter had launched a murderous attack on her. Lois asked Virginia what she was doing. She fought for her life. She suffered defensive injuries. Then Virginia stabbed her 8 times. 7 of those stab wounds were to her chest. And Lois died. 2 parents, 1 home, 1 daughter. And within a matter of hours, both John and Lois McCullough were dead. But Virginia's actions did not stop here, because now she had another problem. She had 2 bodies inside the family home, and she needed to hide them. On the morning after killing her mother, Virginia went to her GP. She needed treatment for a cut on her hand. The injury had been caused while she was stabbing her mother. But Virginia told the doctor something completely different. She claimed the cut was an accident caused while she was cutting vegetables. Then she went into Chelmsford town centre. But she wasn't going there simply to continue her normal life. She was buying items that she would use to conceal the bodies of her parents. Virginia bought sleeping bags. She placed each of her parents inside one. Her mother was placed inside a wardrobe. Virginia then sealed the wardrobe with tape. Later, she partially obstructed it with freeze blocks. Her father was placed inside a makeshift mausoleum constructed from breeze blocks. The family home had now become something completely different. A place where 2 parents had once lived had become the place where their daughter had hidden their bodies. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this story was to come, because Virginia wasn't simply going to hide the bodies. She was going to pretend that John and Lois were still alive. The day her parents died, Virginia began the deception. That afternoon, she used her mother's phone to send a message to one of her sisters. The message gave the impression that John and Lois were away at the seaside. Later that night, another message was sent. "Good night from Mum." And this was just the beginning. Over the following months and years, Virginia continued pretending that her parents were alive. She used their phones. She used different SIM cards. She contacted family members while pretending to be her parents. At one point, she even spoke to one of her sisters while pretending to be their mother. Think about what that required. Every family has conversations. Birthday messages, Christmas greetings, question about health, plans, small everyday details. And Virginia had to maintain the illusion. She had to remember what her parents were supposed to be doing. She had to explain why they weren't available. She had to keep the story going. And she did. For 4 years and 3 months. But there was another reason for maintaining the deception. Money. The murders were not simply about hiding a terrible crime. According to the judge, financial gain was a substantial motive. After her parents' deaths, Virginia continued accessing their finances. She took their pension payments. The total amount of pension money taken was almost £136,000. She used their credit cards. She opened their new credit cards in their names. She spent money from their bank accounts. She took winter fuel payments. She even contacted her father's pension company while pretending to be him. The total amount taken from her parents was almost £150,000. And remember, Lois and John were dead. Yet Virginia was still using their identities, still accessing their money, still creating the appearance that they were alive. She even made calls to police pretending to be her mother about trivial matters. And she contacted her parents' GP, pretending to be Lois. The judge described the deception as an elaborated and enduring web of lies. It wasn't just one lie. It wasn't 10 lies. It was years of lies. And somehow, for more than 4 years, it worked. Eventually, the deception began to crack. In September 2023, the family's GP became concerned. He had not seen John and Lois. Their appointments had repeatedly been cancelled. Something wasn't right. The doctor alerted the police. A police officer contacted Virginia by telephone, and Virginia gave them a complicated explanation. Her parents were supposedly travelling, but the explanation wasn't true. The police weren't convinced. On the 15th September 2023, officers went to the family home. Virginia was arrested on suspicion of murder. But this was the moment the 4-year deception finally came to an end. The police were going to discover the bodies, and they were going to discover who had killed them. But what happened next is remarkable. According to the sentencing remarks, Virginia admitted to police that she had murdered her parents. She told police officers where they could find their bodies. And she did so in what the judge described as a matter-of-fact manner. After 4 years of pretending they were alive, the truth had finally come out. John and Lois had been dead since June 2019, and their daughter had been responsible. Virginia McCullough ultimately pleaded guilty to both murders. The case then moved to sentencing, and the judge had to consider exactly how serious these crimes were. There were 2 victims. Both were her parents. Both murders involved planning. There had been a primary method of killing, and there had been a backup method. The judge found that Virginia had considered killing her parents over a period of 3 months. She had accumulated drugs. She had purchased a knife. She had tested drugs on her parents. She had drugged her father before the murders. And she had prepared weapons in case the poisoning did not work. The court therefore concluded that these were murders involving substantial premeditation and planning. The starting point under the law was so serious that a whole life order was initially considered. That would have meant Virginia spending the rest of her life in prison. But the judge ultimately decided that this was not one of those exceptional cases requiring a whole life order. Instead, he imposed a life sentence with a minimum term. Had Virginia been convicted after a trial, the judge said he would have imposed a minimum term of 40 years. But because she pleaded guilty, that was reduced by 4 years. The result was a minimum term of 36 years. She had already spent 389 days on remand. That reduces the minimum term to 34 years and 341 days. And even after that minimum term is served, release is not automatic. The parole board will have to decide whether she is safe to be released. And if she is ever released, she will remain on license for the rest of her life. One of the most difficult questions in a case like this is simple. Why? Why would someone kill their own parents? Why would a daughter turn against two people who had raised her? Virginia said she felt trapped. She also raised issues about her childhood and her relationship with her parents. Medical evidence presented to the court found that, at the time of the offences, she had developed symptoms of a personality disorder and autistic spectrum condition, and may also have had mild depression. The judge also considered evidence that she had later developed some psychosis. But the judge was clear. The medical evidence did not establish that her autism caused the murders, nor did it substantially reduce her culpability. The judge concluded that Virginia understood that what she was doing. She was able to form rational judgments. She was able to exercise self-control. And the murders were deliberate acts following months of thought and planning. The court therefore found that the financial motivation was central. Virginia had been stealing. She had been lying. She was facing the possibility that her parents would discover what she had done. And the judge concluded that a substantial motive for the parents was to prevent that discovery and allow her to continue taking money from them. But there is another side to this story. The two people who died were not simply names in a courtroom. They were John and Lois. They were parents. They were grandparents. They were brothers and sisters. They were part of a family, and Virginia's siblings were left with something that no prison sentence can ever completely repair. They had not only lost their parents, they had spent years believing their parents were still alive. They had received messages from them. They had believed their explanations. They had been deceived by their own sister. The judge heard moving statements from Louis' brother and from 3 of Virginia's siblings. The judge said the evidence described the terrible effect that the crimes and the deception had on them and their families. And perhaps that is one of the most disturbing elements of this case. The murders lasted minutes. The consequences lasted years. There is something deeply unsettling about the Virginia McCullough case. It isn't only that two parents were murdered by their daughter. It is what happened afterwards. Virginia didn't simply leave the house. She didn't immediately confess. She didn't call the police. Instead, she constructed an alternative reality. She made her family believe that John and Lois were still alive. She sent messages, she made calls, she pretended to be her mother, she used their money, she maintained the deception for more than 4 years. And all the while, their bodies were hidden inside their home. Eventually, however, the lie became impossible to maintain. A doctor noticed that something wasn't right, the police became involved, and the story Virginia had constructed began to collapse. On the 15th of September 2023, officers arrived. The truth was finally uncovered. Virginia McCullough admitted what she had done, and in October 2024, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. A term of 36 years was imposed, reduced to 34 years and 341 days after the credit for time already spent on remand. But there is one final thought that is difficult to escape. Imagine being John or Lois. Imagine lying down in your own home, believing you are safe, believing your daughter is someone you can trust. And imagine that the greatest danger in the house is the person you raised. That is what makes this case so disturbing, because sometimes the most frightening stories don't begin with a stranger at the door. They begin with someone already inside the home, someone you know, someone you love, someone you ever imagined you would need to fear. Virginia McCullough was John and Lois McCullough's daughter, and according to the court's finding, that trust was ultimately turned against them. Their lives ended in June 2019. But the truth about what happened to them remained hidden for another 4 years, until eventually the questions became impossible to ignore. Where are John and Lois? Why haven't they been seen? And what happened inside that house? The answers were waiting behind a hidden door. And when the police finally opened that door, 4 years of lies came to an end.